On March 11th, 2012, I celebrated the 43rd anniversary of my election to the Chicago City Council. I'm so very grateful to have had the opportunity to serve the people of Chicago. I have to say to everyone that from the very beginning, my wife Ann has been the great spirit and soul of my political life and whatever success we have achieved. She has been at my side as a remarkable wife for 44 years. Her diligence and intelligence has not only made her an extraordinary lawyer and now a justice of the Illinois Supreme Court, her character makes her a spectacular wife, mother, and grandmother. She has made these 44 years both inspiring and rewarding. Back in the 1950s, life seemed much simpler, much more anchored. Our world was our neighborhood and parish. We were far more united culturally and religiously. By 1965, I had graduated in the Chicago Police Academy recruit class 65-1A1. Since that time, I've had the privilege of working for or with a long line of Chicago police superintendents, beginning with O.W. Wilson, who reorganized the city's modern police force in the early 1960s with Mayor Richard J. Daley, to our most recent superintendent, Gary McCarty. I served as a Chicago police officer before being elected to the City Council in 1969 as alderman of the 14th Ward on the great Southwest Side. You might recognize the gentleman standing next to me on election night, March 11th, 1969. Former Mayor Richard M. Daley, my law school classmate. For more than 45 years, I have had a relationship of both respect and admiration for the women and men of the Chicago Police Department. Our book, End of Watch, is the product of that respect. Ann and I were married in May of 1968. Just 2 months later, in July of that year, she and Eunice Kennedy Shriver changed the world with the first Chicago Special Olympics. We hardly had time to catch our breaths before the special election for my father's aldermanic seat 8 months later. In August of 1968, the Democratic National Convention came to Chicago, to the International Amphitheater in the old stockyards. So too did a vast army of yippies and protesters from all across the country, too many to count. Chaos ensued. You may recognize me as a young Chicago cop just over Mayor Daley's shoulder behind Alderman Tom Keene. In my first race for alderman of the 14th Ward, I had 6 opponents: Hilda Chemler, Mark Crosby, George Esch, Elizabeth George, James Osinski, and John Tully. I received 11,290 votes and defeated my closest opponent by a margin of 10-1. It made for an exciting election night. The 14th Ward headquarters was awash with friends and loyal workers jubilant at the outcome. Incidentally, the John Tully I defeated in that election went on until recently to serve as a justice of the Illinois Appellate Court. My father, Joe Burke, had held the seat since 1953, replacing Alderman Clarence Wagner, the powerful chairman of the Finance Committee, following his death in a tragic automobile accident in International Falls, Minnesota. Amazingly, with the death of Clarence Wagner, the political destinies of 2 Chicago families changed forever. Back then, Chicago Democrats were becoming disenchanted with Mayor Martin Kennelly. And some Chicago historians believe that Clarence Wagner appeared to have the edge in replacing Kennelly in the mayoral election of 1955. But following Clarence Wagner's untimely death, Democrats turned to the chairman of the Cook County Democratic Central Committee, Richard J. Daley, the county clerk and a rising star in Democratic politics. Richard J. Daley defeated Martin Kennelly in the 1955 primary and then went on to win the election for mayor. To replace Clarence Wagner as alderman of the 14th Ward, my father, Joe Burke, was chosen to run in November of 1953. I think it is fair to say that with these events, life would never be the same in either the household of the Burke or the household of the Daley families. I was 10 years old the first time I met Mayor Richard J. Daley. It was at a St. Patrick's Day parade in 1954. He was still county clerk then, but I knew he was an important political figure. As I was growing up, my dad was always taking me places and introducing me to people. Funny thing about that parade, for years I thought the most important thing about what happened that day was getting to ride home in a fire chief's car, ringing the bell and siren. It is no exaggeration to say that since my election in 1969, I have occupied a front row seat to view Chicago history, like it or not, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I have served in the council with 8 Chicago mayors: Richard J. Daley, Michael Blandick, Jane Byrne, Harold Washington, David Orr, Eugene Sawyer, Richard M. Daley, and now Rahm Emanuel. During that same period of time, I have served with some 254 aldermanic colleagues. On March 14, 1969, City Clerk John C. Marson administered the oath of office to Fred Hubbard of the 2nd Ward, Michael Blandick of the 11th, Terry Gabinski of the 32nd, and myself. Bill Singer of the 43rd Ward would join us later after an election runoff. At the meeting, Alderman Tom Keene introduced a motion out of the regular order of business permitting television equipment and recording devices into the council meeting. The measure, the first one I ever voted on after some debate, was adopted. Some of my colleagues have been part of generational legacies like me. In addition to the 2 Burkes, over the years there have been 6 Cullertons, 2 Meniers, 2 Ogdens, 2 Hollands, 2 Knickerbockers, 2 Bowlers, 2 Bowlers, 2 Clarks, 2 Brants, 3 Keens, 2 Sheridans, 2 Verdoliaks, 2 Austins, 2 Beavers, and 2 Lorinos. I've always believed that it's important to study history, to examine it, and to understand the manner in which events and institutions have come to occur. Nothing is written in stone, especially in politics. But without the ability to comprehend the synthesis of history, how the facts fit together, much can be lost. This is important particularly when, as members of the legislative branch, we have the opportunity on occasions to learn from the mistakes of the past. It has been said, to know the truth of history is to realize its ultimate myth and its inevitable ambiguity. In the City Council, I've had the privilege to represent a historic constituency in the 14th Ward, and as Democratic committeeman to lead the 14th Ward regular organization. The term regular Democrat expresses a construct of political loyalty within the Democratic Party here in Chicago that goes back decades. In our own ward, its meaning began with the establishment of a solid political organization in the 1930s by former Alderman James J. McDermott and appellate court judge John J. Sullivan. In some ways, a regular Democrat is like an Orthodox Catholic, a member tried and true, a faithful loyalist with little affection for mavericks and those of questionable allegiances. This is a cohesion that still holds the team together. And if you would test the veracity of its impact, take the example of John Fitzgerald Kennedy in 1960. It bears out that wisdom. Life must be lived forward, but it can only be understood